It's 7 o'clock.
Okay, then I suggest we get going.
Yeah, so camera off, please.
And we have just John joining us. And Herko.
Good morning.
Herko, sorry, can I ask you just to... Thank you, that's it.
Okay, then we get going. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the participants of our third JIC Open Forum. It's a pleasure that you are joining us from across the world. My name is Ulrike, and I have the honor and pleasure to be in the moment the chairwoman of the JIC. In my normal life, I'm the head of GS1 Healthcare. That means I'm leading a sector in a big standard organization, which is mainly known for the standards in the supply chain and specifically the barcoding. So we are very happy to have you with us this morning. I would like to start with a short introduction. And as we are getting the slides up, the Joint Initiative Council, shortly JIC, what is it? It is a group of standard organizations existing quite a long time already, since 2007. And this SDOs, the Standard Development Organization, which you see listed at the bottom of the slide, have come together to work together. We are working to build a framework of health informatics standards and to drive really interoperability based on driving digital transformation. This is really important because only then implementation of standards will be easy for the implementers. And we will see that, I think, very well today in the example which we are talking about today. And you will see how important it is that cooperation is happening on a global level. Collaboration is happening between organizations. So we are not competitors. We are working together. And our objective is really to avoid overlaps and inconsistency. And with that, to make standards very effective. And with that, drive patient safety, deliver the best possible way healthcare can be delivered, and that globally for every stakeholder across the globe. So what are we talking about today? IPS, the International Patient Summary, is somehow the latest joint activity within the JIC. And a number, nearly most of the SDOs in the JIC have contributed to it and are participating actively in it. It's very global and it's affecting us all because it's really, as it says in the name, about the patient, and that is all of us. I think with the digitalization over the last years, with the pandemic which we are going through, the International Patient Summary has gotten even more attention than before. And you see that reflected in the statement of the G7 at their Oxford, UK meeting in summer of this year. You see it by the activities of the GDHP, the Global Digital Health Partnership, which is really driving the work to make implementation happening across the world. And even if there is no formal endorsement yet, the WHO Digital Health and Innovation Team members also are very interested in the ongoing activities on IPS for, of course, very valid reasons. So this is what we want to discuss today. And we had I think it was in summer, we had our second open forum where we discussed already about IPS and the role it plays in immunization. But what we want to talk today about is really the different parts of IPS. So on the one hand side, the development of it, but also its adoption and its implementation. And we are grateful to the GDHP who supported us in organizing this open forum and has helped us to get several representatives of ministries, authorities from the world who have already started to be deeper involved with the IPS. So talking more about the adoption of the IPS, so that means that a country has declared a lot of interest for its territory. We will have this morning New Zealand, and in the second session this afternoon, we will repeat the session. It will be Argentina who will talk about that. Then we move to the implementation of the IPS, because in addition to the adoption, we need also to make really the steps to implement, and that is really hard work also. And I'm very glad today that we have speakers from the United Kingdom this morning and in the afternoon from Canada. So what will we talk about with regards to the SDOs, experts, and the JIC? Our panelists will share their experience in a discussion this morning, and they will talk about the difference between creating a standard and also maintaining a standard, because standards are not just created and then stand like they are, but they change. And when they change, it becomes even more important that the people involved are really interact with each other, interact with the implementers. And our experts will talk about that this morning. But of course, we want also you to be actively participating in giving your view, giving your experience. And we asked you to, on the one hand side, already enter all the questions you have into the Q&A of Zoom. But we will have also 2 interactive sessions specifically meant to really get you interacting with us, to express your questions, your comments, your concerns. We might not be able to answer all of your questions today or take it into the Mentimeter sessions, but we aim to produce a report also after this open forum, which we will publish. And for sure, we will really consider there your input. So please be active and please participate in this. So on the logistics, as chairwoman, this is my duty to remind you that everybody is on mute, of course not the speakers, but please post your questions. And also if I think we all have now experience with Zoom, please show if you support or applaud something, if you are in approval or if you are concerned about things. There are signs on Zoom which also can do that. And then also all the sessions are recorded and will be available afterwards on our JIC YouTube channel. And this is the agenda and the great speakers of this morning. We will start, as I mentioned, with the SDO panel, and I will introduce them in a second. We will then have the moderated breaks, and Jürgen Brandstetter, representing IHE, will handle that. Alistair Kenworthy from New Zealand will talk about the adoption experience before we move to the UK with John Farrington and Lee Rickless talking about the experience of implementing really. And last not least, Hako Kumans, representing the GDHP here, will share experiences which they have done so far in the work, and will also moderate a little bit discussions before we close them. And with that, I really wish you a very interesting 2 hours. Enjoy the presentations, the great speakers, and also follow us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Social media these days have gotten very important. So you can stay informed on these channels of JIC, not only today, but also in the future. With that, let me introduce the first panel, and it's a great pleasure to have such experts really coming together. The first one being Stephen Kay, who has been involved in hit standards really since such a long time, since 87, Stephen. That's really so impressive. And really in all kind of STOs, from BSI to CEN to ISO, IHE, and important also in the JIC since the beginning. His interest has always been on the electronic health records, and he's playing a really leading role there. So thank you very much for joining us this morning, Stephen. The next speaker, I hope he has joined us, is Graham Grieve, who is the HL7 product director for FHIR, which I think is very well known across the world as really the standard for the exchange of data in healthcare when we talk about personal record, health records. As you can see here, also a wide background working globally in different national programs, but having such an IT background, that's always impressing me very much. And then last not least, we have Amit Trivedi, who is the Director of Informatics and Health IT Standards at HIMSS. And he's working with other STOs, specifically with IHE, is also organizing the largest health IT interoperability testing, the Connectathon of IHE North America. Very impressive, Amit. And interoperability is also in his mission, and that's something which we will see and hear again and again, and that's something which is also very important to the JIC. So with that, I hand over to the three of you, and thank you very much already.
Hello, and thank you very much for this invitation. The CEN project team created a standard for Europe, which was taken up by ISO and turned into a full international standard for the patient summary. This standard defines the core IPS dataset. It uses the concept of IPS data blocks. On the screen, you can recognize 6 blue boxes that represent a data block that is mandatory for the IPS. The 13 white blocks enrich the IPS, its content and coverage. The block that's got the 3 dots in is meant to suggest that the IPS is not exhaustive, but rather it requires the data set to be extensible. Next slide, please. Summarization is a human competence and therefore a fundamental requirement throughout healthcare. All people, all situations. And I will give an example of the rare disease issues that brought up after the IPS was considered at the beginning. Next slide, please. So there are 6,000 to 8,000 types of rare disease, depending how you count them. Does this mean that there will be 6,000 to 8,000 types of IPS? The new candidate blocks, shown in the teal color here, are meant to go through a small case study based on rare diseases and the IPS. So these are candidate data blocks. So if we look at the rare disease, child health, there's 50 to 70% of all rare disease sufferers are children. If we look at family history, then genetics is a very strong component in all these rare diseases. For recent encounters, the patient's disease is likely to be the reason for why the attendance is happening. And for CCG, the attending clinician is likely to have very little knowledge about the rare disease. It may be their first time, and they will certainly probably not see this case ever again. So they will need some guidance, and computable guidance for the IPS would be very useful at this point. Alerts, well, they're especially useful for non-scheduled care. it's difficult to recognize the signs and symptoms, and rare conditions will always be an active condition. And in the end, there's the patient's story. Increasingly, the mediator in the exchange situation, but also an expert source of what's really important to the patient. So here we have the initial 19 data blocks that meant to cover shared care, urgent care, and elected care. And we have 6 candidate data blocks that will cover rare disease, but more than that, they will also generally be useful. So the question I'd like to pose to my other colleagues in the SDOs, in IHE and in HL7, is how do we get these candidate blocks? How do we discover them in the first place? How do we maintain the integrity of the IPS? And in what way will we maintain these data blocks over time? Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Hopefully we'll get my video going, but the host hasn't let me right now. So while, here we go. Hey, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you. As part of my contribution to the panel, I'm looking forward to taking up Stephen Kay's question. As I was asked to talk about the way that the HL7 and the FIRE community interact with implementers and our focus on implementation. And from the beginning of the FIRE project, it's been a key part of the paradigm. It's the way that we engage with the implementation community. And honestly, the thing about FIRE is it's the first standard that HL7's had that's a child of the social media age. And so it's really unfolded quite differently to some of the other specifications, much more open, much earlier on. So here's some of the key things that we did to ensure that we had a very strong implementation engagement. The first was holding Connectathons. And for me, it was important that they were called Connectathons because we were connecting systems. But nevertheless, they have a totally different focus from the IHE Connectathons, which are testing that systems connect well, whereas really HL7 Connectathons are much earlier in the process around checking that they can connect if they conform to the standard. So much more development focus rather than end stage focus. But that's been a really important part of our process. And it's been a key plank of the IPS process from the beginning, that as soon as we have minimum viable something or other, not minimum viable for solving the problem, but minimal viable for testing something, then we start having Connectathons and tests that things actually work together with real people. Well, I used to be able to say in the same room. I can't say that right now, but it's really, if I look back on a 10-year history of the development of FIRE, we really only got going once we started holding Connectathons. There was 3 of us for the first one, the 3 core authors of the standards, just actually testing that our servers had some level of connectivity with each other. And then they just, from my point of view, I basically track the development of the community and the specification, Connectathon to Connectathon to Connectathon, because that's, they drive everything. We try something out and then we drive everything from that. And then we have HL7 meetings are basically the response, but Connectathons are the question. And then early on, we started putting up our test servers in the cloud and leaving them available and then chatting about them all the time. And we've pretty much ended up running a continuous Connectathon all the time with the servers available, people coming and going. Chat.fire.org is impossibly busy with all the implementers looking for help with their particular problems. Probably, it's just an unparalleled resource that we've tried to talk about how would we create that for CDA or V2 or other standards. How would IAG do something similar? And there just isn't the drive in those communities, whereas fire began with that, and so there is the drive, and it's a wonderful thing. And so there's actually a worthwhile question to ask is, how would you get a community that wants to do that with those other standards? Something that I'm still thinking about, because that would be good for implementers, and our rationale is it's got to be good for implementers. That's what we want to do. Another thing that we did, which was really early, is the key editors of the specifications. Now, the plural, but key editors wrote libraries and servers that are widely used in implementation. You know, I get bug reports in my core fire code that produces a standard because I wrote it in such a way that it was usable in production, and just about every morning I wake up to some more bugs in production. But it ties a lot of the core editors. It ties us to implementation, and that's and the fact that I write the validator that's widely deployed. Those are key parts of making the tight connection between the standard and the implementation. Another key thing that I did was we introduced a maturity model. So every artifact that we publish has a published, actually not everything has a published, but we're working towards that, a published maturity level that reflects the degree of engagement and partnership that we've had with our implementation community. And they start out very immature as we're just testing. And retrospectively, you recognize that quite a lot of standards, including ones published by other organizations, have modules that go through this same phase. They're very immature, they get tested, they get iterated on, they become mature as we've got experience, and then we start cementing them up and hardening them to be usable standards. Describing that has let people decide how much engagement they're going to have. Early on in the process, you get much more involved in the design and the feedback. Late in the process, you don't spend so much time churning. It's your choice how much you engage. But a key part of that is that it has given the committees who have stewardship over those artifacts a really strong interest in being partnered with implementers. And from my point of view, one of the really strong things about that is it's given everybody in the HL7 community a strong focus on partnering with other standards organizations that focus more on some of the later phases of the process, for instance, IAG, and I think the partnership is orders of magnitude better than it was, and also the national standards bodies. And so that's, for me, that's a process. It's not something we've achieved. It's an ongoing thing that we'll be tightening up. And of course, sometimes it's not easy because organizations run to different beats, at different life cycles. But the process is irresistible, I think. And that strong focus that we've introduced on implementer engagement through some of these testing and listening and service models that we've created and transformed and implemented have transformed HL7 to the point where HL7 is now working on formalizing those structures and creating a new implementation division. And that reflects the desire and the fact that HL7 has found these kind of engagements beneficial for its overall existence. And of course, creating and formalizing a new implementation division will raise a whole bunch of new questions once we formalize it about how does that interact with other organizations. And like stepping back a little bit, I really see three legs of the standards process. The first is the core platform standards, which primarily HL7 is responsible for. HL7 is primarily responsible for core platform standards. There's lots of other standards organizations who do the same level of standards that everybody's going to use. But because everybody's going to use them, they're pretty general. And there's things that we can't get everybody to agree to that you can get agreement to in a much smaller community. And so then other communities pick up and run with adapting the standard for a particular context of use. And that might be like IAG, which is its primary focus and its stated focus. And then once you've got a ready for use for a particular context, which hopefully matches a business need, then some other organization is going to drive that and cause adoption. And that's more often than not regulatory authorities. But at some organizations, for instance, HIMSS is much better in a position to drive adoption than either H7 or IHE. And so they're kind of three legs, but there's not like clean division, and there's not like separation of concerns at all. It's totally messy. If you're interested in adaptation, of course you're interested in standards. And so IHE produces things that look suspiciously like standards at times because they're just trying to adapt them. There's not a hard division. And it's that mental model of standards, adaptation, adoption that lays out a proper understanding of the community that we're all engaged in, and underpins that we all have to work with each other and maintain good lines of communication that are not only open, but they're busy. And then, of course, we have to deal with the fact that they're so busy. So thank you for listening to me on that subject, and I look forward to the panel and questions. And over to you, Amit.
Well, all right, and thank you, Graham, and good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to join this amazing group of experts in this discussion today. So thank you once again to the program's hosts, the JIC, as well as my fellow panelists. And Graham, so it's a pleasure to work in this messy area of really where we're just trying to collaborate. And as you pointed out, sometimes the lines get blurry, but I think when you have minded folks that are trying to row in the same direction, we find a way to make progress. And so I think some of the things you'll hear about today are how we've been able to collaborate and where we've been able to collaborate. And that really speaks to the spirit of the JIC and why that organization exists. And so in my role, I support IHE's efforts, both through our sponsorship via HIMSS of IHE International, as well as IHE USA Deployment Committee for the US. And so I mentioned some of the work that IHE does is further down on the downstream, focusing closer on the adaptation adoption space. And naturally, part of my role with HIMSS also overlaps as we're really trying to work on, as part of that adoption piece, raising awareness, improving education, and getting the word out there. And so a lot of our collaborative activity is also focused on that education and awareness piece to support adoption and implementation. And so among those areas that we support within IHE are the support of the communities. We have technical committees that we support within IHE, as well as the cross SVO committees, both in HL7 and the ones that include additional SVOs. Our team have been putting on development and testing events. In 2021, IHE tested the International Patient Summary at the European Connectathon in November. Earlier that year, we teed up a workshop as part of the Global Health Track to get folks aware of the IPS and basically that these testing capabilities were present. A lot of, as I mentioned, is our efforts are focused on getting folks interested in adopting and implementing these specific products. And to further aid that, some of our focus has been on resource development. So specifically this year, we worked with OpenHIE, OpenMRS, to develop reference implementations to kind of show people what is possible and demonstrate some use cases using the International Patient Summary. And that was part of the 2021 virtual North American Connectathon. And again, speaking to some of the collaboration and the necessary prerequisites to really get adoption happening, it comes down to making sure that there's tooling and resources available for folks that are able to adopt and want to test. And so again, in the vein of collaboration, IHE USA works very closely with ONC, and that's the Office of the National Coordinator for the US that really focuses on the digital health strategy for the US. And one of the main contractors or folks, organizations that works with ONC as well as IHE is the MITRE Corporation. They've developed a test tool, an open source test tool called Inferno, which supports the US certification program, but we've been working with them via IHE International to make that tool extensible to support IPS validation. And so again, we're looking to see where we can connect the dots to extend resources, further coordination and collaboration, because ultimately, I think across the board, I think one of the biggest challenges is getting folks' attention and getting the right resources to bear at our various events, at our various work groups, to get that volunteer and other workforce mobilized to help support some of these efforts. And then finally, a last piece of that collaboration, IHE, along with HL7 and HIMSS, founded the Global Consortium for eHealth Interoperability. And this is, again, one other effort to help elevate the conversation around standards, to help some of our stakeholders better understand how to work with HL7, IHE, and other standards organizations, and help the standards that we developed work for our stakeholders and for our the consumers of those standards, which are now national ministries of health and national digital health programs. And so finally, I was going to say, you know, one of the important activities that we all work on is helping to support the translation of the various activities that we do, so that folks can understand and relate to the value and importance of the work. And so this can be done through demonstrations like Interoperability Showcase. This can be done through workshops and other educational activities. And so looking forward at 2022, I know that there's going to be a lot of collaborative activities between HL7 and IHE, continuing not only the cross-SDO workgroup activities, but even more collaboration at the Fire Connectathons, at joint Connectathon and testing activities, and we look forward to that collaboration. And so with that, maybe we can kick it back to the actual panel from Stephen and Graham and get some of the discussion going as well.
Hey, Amit.
So Graham, good to see you. I wish we were in the same room.
That would be great, wouldn't it? Getting closer. So one of the things that I was watching you and thinking, one of the challenges for us all is social media has fueled an explosion of interactions, and it's like all the team are saying this to me. How on earth do we keep up? It's great for implementers, but it's getting tough. It's just so much going on, and in a sense, I don't know if you see this, but since we haven't been face to face, the technical interface between us all has increased in volume, but our personal connections haven't, and so that's added to the challenge we all have.
You know, you mentioned how Fire kind of grew up in the era of social media, right? And I think that's one of the reasons why it's not only a standard, it's driving cultural change throughout the industry, right? We see it in, it's changing the way we approach standards development, our activities, how we engage with our audiences. And I was going to say, if anybody feels some extra pressure, it's probably you, as the father of Fire, because folks come to you and they can come to you directly through social media. So I think that's probably challenging, trying to answer all those questions. And I think recently we saw a lot of activity around the reports around fire API and security. But I think, you showed the industry or the community how to step up and tackle those types of things. I don't know if we can do it at scale because not every question can be answered directly by you, but I think I appreciated the way you directly jumped in. Other folks in the community jumped in as well, and we took what may have been something that was kind of getting out of control, and we're able to point people in the right direction to kind of focus the conversation back on track in terms of looking at how we're doing implementation. Not that there's issues with the specs themselves, but it's a matter of implementation and practices which are solvable.
Yeah, yeah, totally agree. Thanks for the kind words, but I think that it's increasingly a key thing for us is social coordination, social collaboration and orchestration of that. And Stephen, I was looking at your question to us, how do we extend the IPS? And all the thinking is totally, how do you organize the community to do it itself, right? How do you gather together the people who want to try out these use cases? And actually, that's one problem that we have with the long tail. It's pretty easy to, well, not easy, but it's practical to find engineers and analysts and clinicians who are incentivized to be part of the community when they work on the core services and so forth that everybody uses. And that's what you do all day, every day. We have hundreds of them now in the fire community. And if they're the ones taking up the questions and answering the questions are very often the lead engineers from the infrastructure providers now, because that's what they do for a living is that kind of stuff. Whereas in the long tail is people who occasionally engage, and your rare disease is clearly in the long tail. And so it's a challenge to incentivize their engagement. And that's principally how I would think about that, is how do you find those people and incentivize them to be involved and engaged almost on a daily basis, because that's the challenge that we have, is decisions are made by committees on a daily basis. And so one of the things that we're trying to fill is a practical way to help people catch up and say, hang on, I missed that, because you blink and you miss something. And that becomes more relevant when you get into the long tail stuff.
So my apologies, first of all, that my screen makes me look very green. And anyway, so I think we face several problems. The IPS is meant to be implementation independent. So we have a number of communities, CDA as well as fire, for instance, that will be interested in having this sort of building block approach. But given that IPS also spans multiple SDOs, it's quite difficult to turn candidate blocks into the formal standard. We don't have a maturity model that goes across SDOs in the same way as you have in fire that's testing each resource. So how would you suggest that we could scale it up to ensure not only that we can discover new blocks that meet the clinician's requirement and the patient's requirement, where we've got SDOs defining things as candidate blocks, but we can't get the engagement necessarily of the clinical community to validate it. What has your experience in fire shown in terms of that type of engagement?
Yeah, it's been challenging. We have a number of regular contributors at FIRE, deeply involved, very clinical folks. We actually built a tool called ClinFire to help them be involved, because they found that they could understand conceptually what was going on, but they just couldn't get involved because they didn't have the technical skills to engage with the technical layer, and they really needed some software to help them, and so we needed some software that was really sort of close to the wire to enable them to be involved in the process. And the guy who wrote that software is David Hay, and he's working now on quite a lot of focus on IPS. And so one thing is to leverage those tools and maybe help David and use that as a way to engage clinicians, because they can't engage at the technical standards, but it's totally relevant how they engage as you know, we need the clinical input. But then the other is, if you think back to my 3 legs, the standardization, adaptation, adoption, there will be adaptation of the IPS. For instance, it's happening in countries are looking at it going, okay, how do we actually do that here? And so that'll totally happen. But one thing is to make sure that the adopters, and I'm talking the regulators, say, what happens before the regulation, the standardization and the adaptation is critical, and we're going to incentivize people to be involved at that level. And that happens kind of organically when you say this is something we're going to do as an adopter, as a regulator, for instance. But if you give the lead time and you have a clear strategy, then people say, okay, I'm going to get involved in that. And then there's a whole lot of things that Amit and I have been talking about. It's really an Amit's bailiwick around workforce motivation, building capacity of the workforce, because you don't pay people directly to be involved in standards. It falls out of a coherent, enthusiastic and motivated workforce as a whole in health informatics. So maybe, Amit, you should talk a little bit about that.
Well, you know, I was hoping you were going to bring that up, because I think workforce development is a huge issue, right? Across the board, folks are challenged with resources, and that includes the human and the human resources as well. And so I think standards provides an amazing opportunity in terms of career opportunities and workforce development. And we've been talking a lot about incentives, and we've heard so much about individual contributions, like amazing individual contributions. But to get to scale, I think we're going to need funding and support that can help us build the infrastructure to really achieve that.
And
Yeah, and so one of the key things for me is that 3-leg business. I've got on my blog about describing the 3 legs with a photo of a 3-legged race, because we're tied together, and I think one of the key things is to be able to communicate to the regulators that these things don't just happen. You can create technical debt and land in a mess, or you can lay out a clear strategy and a clear workforce strategy and let the workforce build itself towards doing what you want them to do. You don't actually have to pay them directly to do it. You have to give them a clear strategy to align around. And then and you work with professional organizations of the type of HIMSS to incentivize, and HIMSS has the reach, and AMIA, and HISA in Australia, and there's others, to incentivize clinical people and say to them, and actually it matters, your engagement, it makes a difference, because you don't see the connection directly, but 5 years after you did your input, you got software running on your desktop, and it's kind of like doing research. It's a 5-year process. Well, health informatics inputs are kind of the same thing.
I would like to thank all 3 of you, Amit and Graham and Steve. Due to time, we need to move on, but I think you have given us a lot of food for thoughts, and I'm curious also the audience will see that. And I'm handing now over to Jürgen Brandstetter, who will handle this breakout session and interaction with our participants. Jürgen is participating in the GDHP on behalf of the Austrian Ministry of Health. And he is also one of the real standards experts and passionate about interoperability based on standards in health IT, active in multiple standards organization. And Jürgen, I hand over to you, and really looking forward to this session also. Thank you very much again to the STO's panelists.
Yes, thank you very much, Ulrike, and thanks for introducing me. As people maybe have noticed, my picture on the slide is not fully compatible with my picture on the screen right now. So you see what COVID is really a dangerous virus. You see what happens to people in the crisis. But anyway, I thank you very much for the opportunity to moderate this break now, which is actually a break for us, to be honest, and a fake break for you, because as you see, we want to get you engaged in this meeting. And you see on the slide a QR code, which we would really like to view it. It leads yourself to a web page called Menti. It's Mentimeter. And please enter your code, this code on the slide there, so that you get to our prepared questions. So what we would like to do with you in this break is to give you a series of rather easy questions, and we ask you to give us the answers on that. And please, dear STO panelists, stay tuned here, because I will probably refer to you in conjunction to these questions to give maybe the one or other comment. So Robert, could you please move on to the Mentimeter so that we can click on it. So yeah, you should maybe see a thing like this, and now you should see the first question coming up. And yeah, as you see it on the slide, people are already answering this. So obviously it has worked out. So thanks for this. With this first question, we just want to get an overview and an impression where you are from. And we see that's a quite good mix here. Of course, we have a lot of participants out of Europe, but also the other regions of the world are presented here, and even Africa, which makes me especially happy, because Africa is such a large continent with so much demand on e-health and on health and on e-health. And so welcome you guys being in this forum. Yeah, and we have North America, we have Oceania, we have Asia. That's very nice to see. Let's wait for some more moments. And I use the time to thank the panelists from before to let's say, really give the audience a good impression where the standards organizations are at the moment, because I think that's very important. The key points are collaboration and cooperation, not only among the SDOs, but also between the agencies and ministries out there who want to use those standards. So I think that the e-health challenges are so huge in the next decade that this new way of work together, it is not just nice, it's actually essential that we really tackle the challenges ahead. So, well, okay, so we see our mix of participants, largely Europe, but also the other regions. So Robert, maybe we can flip over to the next slide, which is our first real question. So please, could we ask the audience, which of the IPS standards are you familiar with? And you see a set of options here, and please just click your answer. You see as it's already moving. And it's a pretty equal distributed, although we have a slight advance on the HL7 fire IPS standard. And what we realized within the standards community is that it's that we really should work on converging those, because IPS is IPS, and we know that people outside implementers in the agencies would like to see easy solutions ahead. If I'm an implementer in a country, then I would like ideally a copy and paste template how to implement a certain e-health use case. That would be my dream come true. So we, from the standards community side, shall work into that direction. Yeah, so we see a clear favorite here, which is the, let's say, the native HL7 fire IPS specification, which is actually also the root of everything, and the, let's say, the core place where IPS is developed and further developed at the moment. But obviously the ISO version of it is, of course, known to everyone, and rather small, to be honest, but the SNOMED IPS reference set through. Okay, thank you very much for this, and let's move on to the next question, because we need to look a little bit on the time. So this is what you know, and now the question is, what of those do you have you implemented actually? And this is now getting a bit more interested, because we have the impression that IPS is a great standard, that it has a huge potential, and that it's well recognized everywhere, but that it's just starting to be implemented. And I think what I see on this graphics, that our impression is kind of confirmed by you, because we see, unfortunately, the non-option being the huge favorite. I mean, dear panelists, looking at this, is that a bit, confirming the impression you have, Graham, for example?
Well, I think one of the questions that I have had when I answered this question, probably is true for everybody, is what exactly does it mean to have implemented the IPS? Have you actually taken something into production and you have IPSs exchanged with clinical use? Now, I'm pretty sure the answer for that is not very much at all. But maybe if you mean, yeah, I've actually done an implementation and I've done, some prototype exchange or demonstrative exchange, then probably, yeah, we've done a bit more actual implementation. So it's kind of like, what exactly does that mean? And there certainly is people out there who've implemented the IPS reference set in their production terminology servers. That doesn't mean that they're using it clinically, because it tends to flow through the infrastructure first. And there's certainly people who've built demonstrative IPSs for IPS Connectathons. They're published. There's probably 20 or 30 organizations who've done that, but I don't think anybody's got it in clinical production yet.
No, yeah, you are fully right, and I think what people think of implemented is kind of substantial implementation in a region or in a nation, for example, in that sense. But we are running a bit out of time, so let's move on to the next question. What type of support would you expect from the SDOs in helping you implement the IPS? And with implement, we mean, at least preparing it for some substantial regional and national rollout. So, yeah, you can type in any word you would like. So just type in expertise, and let's see what shows up. Guidance, training, okay, support, advice on detailed queries. So they're quite even distributed. Or guidance seems to be a bit of the winner here. I mean, and education. So guidance and education examples, all of around that, you know, that means actually that seems to me to be a call for action to the SDOs to, you know, not only advance the standards in a technical way, which we certainly do, but also to do the other homework around, which means, you know, providing, as it says, guidance, education, how to use IPS, how to bring that into the field. And I think the GDHP is a great partnership with direct access to such implementers who could convey or be the bridge, you know, between the SDOs and different regions and countries to implement it. So I think we will look on this slide or this outcome offline to see what's in there. But let's now move on in the interest of time to the last slide. Oh, okay. Seems that we are not doing the last slide. At least the screen sharing has stopped on my side. Robert, is that intentional?
Oh, no, here we go.
Okay, but okay. However, oh no, here we are back again. So last question, what advice would you give to the SDOs in moving forward with the IPS? So again, please type in whatever you like. What you would dream of that we are doing. Keep at it. Okay, that sounds good. More awareness of what is the question? Work together, we certainly do that. Community engagement, bringing more people in. Yeah, you're all welcome, you know, to our groups. We are open. Have to start simple and then move forward. Yeah, that goes back to the guidance and education. I think that's a huge task for us to work on that field. And also the Global Consortium for e-health interoperability, where IHE, HL7 and HIMSS are teaming up. I think it is a great forum to maybe work into that direction. So we see there are a lot of terms floating in, and we will certainly look at that, but I'm very sorry, but in the interest of time, I need to close this break now. So it was not really a break, it was a fake break. A lot of work for all of us. But anyway, I hope you have enjoyed it this time, and I now get back to Ulrike to moderate on the next session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jürgen. That was really very interactive and very interesting to see what the audience is thinking and to hear their input. And we move now forward to the first adopter, and it's a big pleasure to have Alistair Kenworthy with us. Kia ora, Alistair. He's coming from the New Zealand Ministry of Health, where he's the Chief Standard Advisor, is also chairing the National Health Information Standards Committee, and working really also, I see this with pleasure, with health providers and their industry partners to ensure that standards really contribute to a good and best healthcare of the world. And he is also representing New Zealand on SNOMED and is chairing their International Members Forum. So a world of experience. As you're also part of the GDHP, we are very happy to have you on board today, and looking forward to your presentation and your experience on moving forward in this direction of IPS. Thank you, Alistair.
Kia ora, Ulrike, and hello everyone. It's a privilege to speak today at the JIC Open Forum. As a start to my Karero or conversation with you about the International Patient Summary, allow me to tell you a little bit about my home country. Next slide, please. These are the two main islands of Aotearoa, New Zealand. They sit on a submerged subcontinent that 80 million years ago adjoined what would become Australia and Antarctica. But with movement over time, we're now at several hours distance by air from our nearest neighbours. Our shores were reached for the first time just 800 years ago by voyagers from the Pacific Islands who navigated by the stars. Next slide, please. Centuries later, their Maori descendants, the Tangata Whenua or indigenous people, signed a treaty with the newly arrived British settlers, and this treaty stands today as the basis of our bicultural nation. New Zealand is also proudly multicultural, with people from around the world having made their home here. We remain habitual travellers ourselves, and we welcome visitors, with tourism a big industry for us. Next slide. As 2021 and the second year of the pandemic closes, New Zealand's team of 5 million has a double vaccination rate that has ticked up to 88% for ages 12 and over. And we are introducing a regional traffic light system to protect the population and our health services. We're on the edge of our seats right now. As we make plans for 2022, it's certain that our escalating COVID response will depend on better knowledge and management of everyone's health status. In this, we're enthusiastic adopters of the standard for core personal health information and its communication, that is the International Patient Summary. Through and beyond COVID, the IPS promises to be a tool for making our health system one that is more connected, more data-driven, and much fairer to everyone. So this is first about the health and well-being of New Zealanders and visitors to our shores, but the IPS is in a way also about our economy and our place in the world. These are all themes that bear on New Zealand's adoption of the IPS. So my first personal brush with the IPS was attending a talk at the 2018 SNOMED Expo in Vancouver, which you can see pictured, given by, and he's on the call, I can see, the respected Don Newsham, representing ISO TC 215 Canada, who introduced to the audience the recently published at that time JIC Patient Summary Standards Set and its initial focus on the unplanned care use case. The project built on the same European Union guidelines for a patient summary that would spark the HL7 and ISO work, which has led to the IPS we know today. Next slide, please. On my return from Canada, our National Health Information Body, a standards body called HISO, made a careful statement recognising the patient summary standards set, noting its coherent approach and broad base of support across standards development organisations, particularly the JIC group. It looked like something that we could reasonably expect our software industry partners to get enthusiastic about too. At the same time, we wanted a standard that would give the patient a voice in their own health record to include their health and wellness goals and a care plan, for instance. So with subsequent developments from HL7 and ISO, we were soon able to add to our endorsement of the IPS at a national level to our earlier statement. Next slide, please. Stepping beyond the familiar person-centered mantra, we have in New Zealand the indigenous cultural perspective of Maori, of course, and their holistic concept of Paiora, which encompasses Moriora, Whanaora, and Waiora. And this means an interdependence of healthy individuals and healthy families within a healthy environment. In New Zealand, we must incorporate Paiora and other Maori concepts in the way we do healthcare. This is part of our obligations under the treaty. And we can learn a lot from Maori. The sort of content we put in a patient record and accordingly how we use the IPS will in a way be informed by these cultural considerations. A live vehicle for this change is our national digital health program called HERA, which sets out to create data services and a marketplace of universal apps and solutions for a much better consumer experience across everybody in the New Zealand population. Of course, we have everybody's problem of scattered and fragmented data that doesn't follow the person in their interactions with the health system, and these are problems around the world. As a common currency for health data exchange, the IPS truly promises to be quickly adaptable to new consumer-facing applications, as well as the transitions of care that have resisted all efforts to move beyond a PDF model of data transfer to truly actionable data. Continuity of care, consumer access to personal health information, and data portability are our most important use cases for the IPS in New Zealand. One of the applications we foresee will allow patients to enrol online with a new general practitioner and drag and drop their records in IPS format to the new provider's mailbox, if you like. This newfound data portability will make it easier for consumers to move between providers and take up online services as they become increasingly available. Next slide, please. The coronavirus and its new variants has proved to be too strong for elimination in New Zealand as elsewhere, and we're gearing up to provide COVID care in the community. For somebody with a positive test result isolating at home, we need to know their health status, risk factors, and the situation of the people around them. In this, we're turning to the IPS to shape the information needed for remote at-home monitoring, in-person care, and any hospital admission. The information flows need to be optimized to make the best use of our resources in providing adequate care. This year, the WHO published technical guidelines for a smart vaccination certificate, or as it was eventually titled, Digital Documentation of COVID-19 Certificates Vaccination Status, and it has a nicely engineered connection to the file implementation guide for IPS. Next slide, please. The social determinants of health are important concerns in New Zealand. The IPS allows for social determinants to be expressed, and we need to make sure this is a structured and coded part of the record for it to be relevant in New Zealand. One example is our government's smoke-free goal, and it was announced today that smoking, the ability to purchase cigarettes, would be ring-fenced from the new generation of people in New Zealand aged 14 and under, who will not in their lifetimes be able to buy cigarettes. For everybody else smoking, we need to have this information in the patient record. Housing is also a key social determinant in New Zealand as elsewhere. Growing numbers of New Zealanders live in substandard, crowded housing in neighbourhoods that may be overserved by fast food and liquor outlets. So if we're to have an equitable health system, we need this sort of information about a person's social and environmental risks in the IPS. Next slide, please. In New Zealand, we have several things in our favour in terms of implementing the IPS. We have a National Health Index number. We have a National Immunisation Register, and we have some other national systems. So our data is centralised already to a large degree, and our Health Act, Health Information Privacy Code, and Health Information Retention Regulations are all seen as enabling rather than constraining. Next slide, please. In 2020, we published an interoperability roadmap that shows the way to a considerably more joined up health system. Our principal standards for interoperability are painted in the roadmap in very bright letters. Adherence with the standards is made a condition of all public investment in health information systems and consumer health platforms. We are now having clinical champions who are appointed to take the message to their colleagues that standards matter, and it is signalled to our industry partners that the standards are required and they will be incentivised to take them up. In 2021, with Standards New Zealand, we became a participating member of ISO TC 215. Next slide, please. HL7 Fire and SNOMED CT need no introduction. They are our paramount standards for interoperability alongside IPS, and we're standing up tools to support them. SNOMED is an ever more expressive and elastic terminology with new content and features continually rolling out. Increased automation and content development and quality assurance, along with the experienced team, allow the terminology to keep pace with health science. SNOMED CT will make for rich, descriptive and actionable personal health content in the IPS. And New Zealand, as a SNOMED international member, is pursuing full adoption of SNOMED CT across our health system. Next slide, please. I would mention the GS1 standards for automatic identification and data capture that are used in New Zealand. Our medicines, devices and supplies carry barcoded GTINs, and healthcare organisations and facilities are assigned global location numbers, GLNs, as standard identifiers. And we've used them in our COVID QR posters, for instance. Next slide, please. Returning to the interoperability roadmap, we plan to follow the excellent example of the all-purposes dataset specification published by the ONC in the US and produce our own New Zealand core data for interoperability. We really admire the focus on the essentials, and our promised specification will be technology neutral, easily digestible by a wide audience, obviously support the FHIR tooling process, and it will underpin our adoption of the IPS. Our interoperability roadmap also owes a considerable debt to the Global Digital Health Partnership white papers and also the Australian Digital Health Agency's interoperability work. Next slide, please. So the NZ IPS will be the New Zealand take on the IPS, filling in the blanks, trimming any excess and extending the payload to meet our requirements as I've described. For the most part, this means applying SNOMED CT reference sets and value sets to the FHIR model. In this, we want a free hand to use our own SNOMED CT national extension, which adds those culturally specific concepts and terms that I was talking about, and includes a set of patient and whānau-friendly terms for the most common health conditions. There are some implications for cross-border interoperability in these national choices, and we foresee the need for a two-speed approach that pairs a domestic NZ IPS with an international version. One will be mappable to the other. So I hope I've painted a picture of the importance of the IPS to Aotearoa New Zealand, a bicultural and multicultural nation defined by distance, but also a willingness to participate as we set about upgrading to a smarter and fairer health system. To close, I'd like to acknowledge everybody participating in the GDHP interoperability workstream and also the ONC for their excellent leadership this year in pushing the IPS. Ngā mihi nui, thank you everyone.
Thank you so much, Alistair, for describing the journey of your country to IPS. That was really very interesting. And without further ado, I hand over again to Jürgen for our next Mentimeter session.
Yeah, thank you very much. So another working break ahead for you. So please, if you could share the screen, Robert, with the Mentimeter. We have prepared a couple of new questions to you, which are more into the direction of adoption, as we just heard. I mean, thanks, Alistair, for giving us these insights. And indeed, the GDHP is the vehicle to do so and get that going in the countries, or one important vehicle, so to speak. So, but yeah, I see people are already answering the first question, which is basically if there is some kind of summary health record in your region, and we see that there is quite some. There's over half say yes, and only 15% say no, which is a good sign, to be honest. A bit surprising, because I personally thought not that the fraction is like that, but that's good, and that's very good. And yeah, now since the graphic stops moving a bit, we should go ahead to the next question, which is for those who have such a summary, is it based on the IPS? And we have prepared a set of possible answers, because IPS is also a toolkit. So yes, we see that people understand the answers. No, it's a local format. There are quite some. Yeah, of course, some don't have one. Yes, and we see, you know, there to some extent is a clear, you know, winner here, and we have no answers on to large extent, or let's say the complete adoption of the IPS as such, which means that the toolkit aspect of IPS is of significant importance, which we actually thought, and we see that already in the WHO, for example, what was mentioned by Alistair, where some parts of IPS were used for the WHO vaccine credentialing record. So thanks. Yeah, that gives a good impression to us. So let's move on to the next question. What type of support would be needed to adopt the IPS standard for national and regional implementation? So that's a bit different to the first question we had on that. So this is more, you know, what would you like to see as a support if you really want to implement that in your national or regional area? Okay, more promotion, a clear IPS specification. So obviously we need to work on a better clarification, you know, what is the toolkit, what is the IPS as a, let's say, final document set of parts of the toolkit. EU Commission endorsement, that's interesting. That's obviously an answer for someone from the European region. Yeah, as far as I know, the IPS is of course on the radar. EU in each EHDSI has currently a European patient summary format because development was started before IPS was in place. Actually, IPS was a follow-up activity after the EPSOS development of the European patient summary. But Europe is for sure going to update its specifications to the IPS standard in the next phase of each DSI. It will need some time, but it will be done. Yeah, okay, thanks for all of these hints. We will through a few to that thoroughly, but we see again education, promotion is in the lead, but also regulation. And we take that as what the Europe did, or maybe what US ONC does, you know. So that seems to give people confidence if some larger regions or larger bodies kind of endorse that in some way, also WHO perhaps. Thanks, and let's now move on to the last question, which is actually, yeah, which should give us a bit of a, you know, guidance and where we are and where we stand. So we don't know, of course, if you are actual decision makers in your country or in your region, but the question is, would you support the adoption of IPS in your country, state or region if it comes to the development of a summary health record or to an update of a summary health record? And we see, you know, I just was thinking that no one is answering because it was just a blue circle, but we see that, you know, it's just yeses coming in and one don't know. Okay, so one person is undecided, but this seems to be good news for us, dear colleagues. Obviously, at least the audience seems to be very much in favor of IPS. So, Alistair, seems that you get some backup because you have just declared that New Zealand stepped ahead, you know, in the implementation of IPS. And you're already very far. Does that make you feel confident that you took the right choice?
Yes, I've never seen a standard with so much groundswell of support behind it is the IPS. So let's ride that wave. Let's keep that wave going.
Yeah, full agreement. And I think from what we see happening is that the IPS is the topic where there's the OSA line around it, and also the GDHP has taken it up as a work item to drive forward the adoption globally of the IPS. For me, the IPS is really a template how standards development should be done in the future. So we should do it together, and we should engage the users and the creators of the standards should engage into the development and the adoption of the standards. So a full collaboration is needed, because that proves that the standard is developed in the right way and fits exactly the need of the adopters outside. So I think that's the way to work in the future. And it's good that you confirmed that, dear audience. And I see that's really encouraging for us. So I hope I have catched up some time now, Ulrike.
You did.
And back to the studio.
Thank you so much, Jürgen. That was really encouraging to see. And I think IPS is also a standard we all can personally relate to, right? So let's see how this will look like in practice and in the implementation. And we have with us now colleagues from the UK. The first one is John Ferrandon, who is the Program Director for Strategy Discovery and Research Shared Care Records Program at the NHSX, which is really the agency which is driving in the name of the UK government, the policy and developing best practices for the NHS digital future. And John has a world of experience in that. And as you can see here on the slide, so thanks a lot for joining us today, John. And with him is somebody who is really then working at the CIO at an NHS Foundation Trust. And Lee, as you can see here, is also the Program Director of the implementation at Yorkshire and Humber, and is developing an open platform where implementation is happening. So I'm also curious to hear, how does it look really like if you implement IPS? And thanks a lot for joining us in this early morning also for you.
Thank you. Good morning. So we're going to go quite quickly through this because we are showing some slides from an operational prototype. So we will be going quickly. Next slide, please. So the context is that we've heard before, the G7 health ministers made a commitment to explore the adoption of the IPS standard when they met in Oxford, England in June this month. Next slide, please. Given they met in June, we didn't have a lot of time to consider what we were able to do, but we have a portfolio of projects, one of which is to think about how we might simulate an example of a patient being abroad. Now, when a patient is abroad, the base case is that a clinician might want to talk to them and it's reliant on their memory. And clearly that's difficult. We decided to focus around patient-mediated records. So sharing that information between a patient and their clinician through patient mediation. Next slide, please. We had to think of a model that could work for all countries, recognizing their varying health systems and different legislation and infrastructure. And so we've got a conceptual architecture that you can see in some of the documentation we'll publish later. Next slide, please. Our model has three elements to it. First of all, confirming the requester. How do we know the patient is who they say they are? Then secondly, how we generate their IPS record and pass it to patient control. And I think that's an important factor. And then next stage is to consume the IPS, how it can be shared. But it's the patient's choice to share and the professional's choice to consume and use it. Next slide, please. So we have first part, which Lee is going to talk about in a moment, is how we confirm the request to ensure that the patient is actually legitimate. And we're able to use this through pieces of our national infrastructure. We have a national identity capability called NHS Login. We're also assuming that the patient is using some sort of personal health record application. And in this example, it's called Helm. Next slide, please, and over to Lee.
Thank you, John. So yeah, there will be a bit of an NHS and a UK branding, but again, this could be any particular system. We are working in the language of FHIR, and we've put a lot of time and effort into making sure our systems are FHIR compliant. We are internet first. We do work with open standards and open source. So a lot of the technology we're showing today is transferable. It's reusable by others. And it's got them open source licenses as well. So what we've got is the NHS login. So we just go through an NHS login process, but other countries will have their method of authentication. So next slide, please. So for those people in the UK, you will go through the normal process of using an NHS login to confirm your identity. And if it's the first time you actually do log on, you would just need to validate the particular device. So next slide, please. So in this case, the way the NHS app and login works is it'll take you through any authenticated system. So in this case, it's Helm, but there are other systems that could work. And it's basically a patient health record. This is an open source coded system. And you would look to click on the shared medical record information. As you can see, it's very like a normal patient health record. It has summary information and other information you may wish to include. So next slide, please. So in this case, we're focused for the development just on the GP record, but in principle, it could be GP, it could be acute, it could be social care, it could be mental health. We have got that information flowing in FHIR at this point in time, but we're going for summary information, which is really conditions, allergies, medications, information results. So really key information. So you would look at the record, check it is the right information, you're happy with that information, and then click next. So next slide, please. Thank you. In this case, the particular system, and we do see value with this when we've engaged with patients, is also have other notes, because not every system covers every permutation that's been covered in by our previous colleagues in New Zealand. So in this case, we've kept it simple, and there's an allergy to cats, but equally it could be, and the carer of my wife, and their information is, or I have this information, that information. So basically what could be quite an easy extension to a FHIR message. So you've put the notes on, so next, click continue. So next slide, please. Normally this would auto-populate. The reason it's here is because it is a demonstration system, which is if you, I will send a QR code after the demonstration, which will run through it in real time rather than as a slide deck, but this would auto-populate. But you could then amend details as you may need to. So next slide, please. So it's just making you aware that you're going to create sensitive information. You have some summary. This could vary based on each country's legislation and legal text, etc. And as long as you're okay with that, click on the share record and next slide, please. So what would happen there is it would create a QR code, would stamp with an approach to be approved. We would say on the particular date it's created. There is a question of where we'd do expiry, etc., etc. You'll notice on the access log, we will touch on that a little bit later. It does keep a full audit trail of who accessed the record when and how that's been done. So if you can go to the next slide.
And that's
so what
back to me.
Yeah, go on, John.
That's back to me. So the second stage of our process is we've generated an international patient summary, drawing data from our general practitioners system using a piece of national infrastructure. We've aggregated the data into a FHIR store. We've used an aggregator because we can flexibly add other data sources in at a later stage. And we've stored it stored that record in a file store as a personal data store using the W3 solid protocol. And it's really important to understand that at this point, access to that record becomes the patient's responsibility and under their control. So back to Lee for the rest of the story.
Thank you, John. So next slide, please. Okay, so the patient will receive an email on the address they provided, and it will give a certain bits of information. So it'll give the QR code. It'll also give a PDF version of the record, and that's mainly due to the fact you can't always be sure will you have an internet connection, where will you need that information, but you'll have that local record. It's also possible to add it to something like Apple Wallet. There are other operating systems available to be able to hold the QR code and the record. But the key bit is that's in the patient's control, and there's two aspects here that I'll touch on. One around the actual patient sharing the information. The other one is being able to give the carer the ability to share the information. So next slide, please. So when the patient goes to the QR code, initially they'll have to be asked to validate identity. So in this case, we're using a very simple approach, very similar to what we got to be honest, and how we've done COVID app, our COVID app in the UK, where the patient will receive a confirmation authenticator to say an access to the records being requested. You'd put the access code detail into the record and then press continue. So next slide, please. So next slide. So you've seen the access code come through, and that'll give the patient a copy of the record as it was generated at that point in time, as you can see, with the time, date, and also the information that's in the record, which they can look through. As the record is accessed, every time it is accessed, it will the patient will receive a text message to say the record has been accessed. So it gives that level of assurance, and that will cover in the audit trail that's in the back end of the system. So if we can now move on, so if we can go to the next slide.
So this is back to me again, and it's the final stage and the scenario where the patient requires care in another country. They present that code to the clinician that they see, and then the clinician will, through an authentication process that you're about to see from Lee, extract an HTML rendering of that file record from the personal data store. Back to you, Lee. Next slide.
Yeah, next slide. So if it's not appropriate for the patient to share the record on their device, then there is the option to give the care provider access to the record. So in that case, the patient would give access to the QR code to the care provider. The care provider would then get a summary screen explaining who they are, what organisation, and email address. There is a concept of the emergency access which we still need to work around, but at this point it's not emergency access. So the caregiver would complete that information and that request be made. The patient would then receive a text message saying a request has been made, and are you going to allow that request or not allow that request? And the reason for that, even though everybody's in the same location, it gives that full ability to confirm, yes, access should be given and it is completely appropriate. So next slide, please. So the patient then is sent the message and the access details are processed. So next slide. So once the patient has confirmed the access, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, you then get the international patient summary that we've put together. Now, in the top right-hand side, we would suggest we'd have the country of origins flag identifier, and also we've placed the authoritative body where the information has come from. Now that could be several bodies, but in this case we've gone where it's NHS England in this case, and that provides the level of detail that would be provided by the patient and also the any secondary information. So that's now available to the care provider to access. Now, every time that care provider would access that record, that would be audited, one within the system, but also the patient would receive a text message to confirm access. So next slide, please. We've also been looking at the translation of the languages. So in this case, when the request is made, it could have a choice of, in this case, German. Now, I realise that not all that screen is German. I've got, we realise that. But what we have done is, where there's the appropriate codes that convert into other languages, so where it's English or German or other languages, we've been able to convert that based on the request. There's still the formatting issue to change the other information, such as active problems, headers, into an appropriate language. Now, it's converting it because the terminology on that particular code is in that language. If it wasn't available in the language, it would stay in the language of origin. In this case, it'd be UK English, but in principle, it could be any language it's come from. So it would allow the ability to read it in the language of the care provider or the country that's been providing care, rather than the country of the person that's that they've come from. So next page, please.
And that's final. That's the end of our presentation. We're very happy to take questions. There's some contact details there, and we can follow it up. And we're very happy to contribute the work that we've done to the international community. Thank you.
Yeah, there is a very good video that runs through this. It's only about 15 minutes, that runs through it in real time rather than the slide deck. It does operate a lot better. I'll send the QR code link and put it onto the website, etc. following this particular open forum.
Thank you both so very much. That was a really impressive run through the practice, how it looks in practice, really, the IPS. And I really appreciate also that you're thinking about other languages, people traveling across borders and having difficulties to communicate. So really great, and I'm sure we will come back to you with more questions. With that, it is my pleasure to now introduce to you Herko Cummins, who is representing the GDHP here. And I would like to thank you already very much in the name of the JIC for helping us to organize this, to get excellent speakers, really. So a big thank you for that already, Herko, and that's really much appreciated. You will now talk a little bit about the GDHP and also moderate a little bit of discussion. And we are very grateful to have you. You are working with the Dutch Ministry of Health in The Hague and have a lot of experience also in the e-government environment, as well as with the European e-health network, the SNOMED, STO, and other of the e-health areas in which you're active. So very glad to have you, and again, a big thank.
Trying to start my video. Thank you for having me. Yes, now my video is starting. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Alistair and John and Lee, for your excellent presentations. Before we go into the panel discussion, I'm not sure if everyone who's participating in this webinar knows what the GDHP is. We're very good at these acronyms. The GDHP is the Global Digital Health Partnership, and there's now 36 national digital health authorities or regional digital health authorities participating. And it's a collaboration between those to work on topics like interoperability, cybersecurity, clinical and consumer engagement, so we can align our digital health policies and increase our effectiveness, both from within our own countries, but also cross-border, of course. Our vision is to support governments and health system reformers to improve the health and well-being of their citizens through the best use of evidence-based digital technologies. India is our current chair, and the USA is the current vice chair of this excellent collaboration. I represent the Netherlands in this collaboration, and I'm also a part of the interoperability work stream, where we have a specific work group focusing on the IPS. And the work we're doing there is to bring the IPS and to accelerate the adoption of IPS in each of our countries together. So we have mini Connectathons, and we try to collaborate with organizations like the JIC to increase the adoption. But let's close this slide and let's see the panel, because we're now going to start the discussion. My first question is to John and Lee, and thank you again for this excellent demonstration. And I think many people will want to see the video of this as well. My first question is, it's focusing on patient-mediated IPS exchange. And in your demo, you can already see that you already thought through a lot of the steps that need to be done. Have you engaged patients, and what are their reactions to this capability that they're now getting from you?
I'll pass that question to Lee, because he's been the driving force behind the development.
Yeah, thanks, John. So yeah, we have engaged with patients, and the key bit we've had from patients, to be fair, is the what's important to me information generally. So it's the bit that gets missed in the gaps between some of the structured data. There was the secondary issue, which was one of the reasons why we looked at other languages, is the difficulty to communicate when people are abroad and have difficulty explaining complex drugs, medication issues, allergies, and that concern. And part of that reason is you get that stress level raising. So if you've got a patient and carer and the reality of, how do I communicate that? And I'm in a very stressful situation. That type of technology can help. The other bit was having the ability to do that offline as well with a PDF. That was quite key to a lot of people, to have that ability to do have that access. So generally pretty positive. The secondary bit is with the take up of COVID apps, which we've got internationally. That's really been a game changer on some of these conversations as well. So I think the issue we probably have had is well, why can't we do this already? Because we're doing it with COVID, and that's where we've looked to enhance and build on. So generally, we still have some challenges. So the challenges around where you've got a carer that needs to be the custodian of the information for the patient, husband and wife, and unfortunately because of disabilities or other issues, that still needs to happen. So there's some issues around how we need to manage that, and there's some of the technical issues of how do they really operate some of the technology, but generally really positive. But again, it's the things about me that really come across loud and clear, that most of the patients saw as really important, because it's what's important to them rather than what's important to caregivers, realistically. So and there's quite a lot of information we have done on engagement generally for sharing of information, trust, etc. So yeah, hopefully that helps answer the question.
Yes, thank you very much. And Alistair, I noticed that you're using the IPS to accelerate the national use of patient summaries, and that John and Lee have focused on cross-border the use case. I'm interested in what the reason is behind that choice of using the international, probably one of the most global standards that we now have getting some traction for a national use versus the international use case. And Alistair, if you could go first on that.
Well, it's certainly true that we see tremendous value in just using it for domestic purposes. And the pressing need is around our COVID response and being able to provide care largely at home for people suffering COVID, which we expect to see in much larger numbers, and but having that information about comorbidities, risk factors, their situation around housing, income, all those kind of things which are going to predispose them to a worse outcome from COVID, is really, all of that is accelerating our efforts to get a core set of personal health information, and the IPS is just the perfect model for that.
John, Lee, you want to add to that?
I did actually. In the UK, we're in a strange position because we have effectively 4 countries, and each country is responsible for its own healthcare. So we are thinking about how we might use the IPS within the UK to share information across our 4 UK countries. Because we worked on the basis that if we couldn't do it within the UK, we weren't going to make it work globally. So we can be a little test case, both from a national and actually an international point of view.
Yeah,
very interesting.
Yeah, and to add to that, we do have different languages in the UK as well. So some of the issues we've touched on already are still as pertinent, whether it's within the UK or international. So it's a really good method of testing. Will the technologies work, and how do we deal with that, at least within that more controlled environment? So I think that's just another helpful point to add.
Okay, thank you. And I also hear from you both that COVID and the use of COVID apps has been an accelerator for this this development. So it seems like the IPS is the right standard at the right time right now. What does that teach us about all the other implementation and adoption projects that we've been trying to get to this level of traction and this type of support? I mean, the G7 have supported this. The GDHP has adopted the IPS. But what does that teach us for all the other things that we've been trying to get to this level for the past 20 years? Is there any thing that we can, why now only the IPS, and what's the next step?
Well, I think we've seen a huge acceleration in the adoption of the technology as a result of the pandemic. And what we've basically done is put to one side some of the slightly esoteric conversations that we've had and been very pragmatic and practical. And as somebody once pointed to me, having something that works for 80%, as long as it's safe, but works now, is well worth waiting, rather than waiting for a 100% solution in 10 years' time. So I think we've changed to be very much more pragmatic in the recent years. But of course, we have to make sure that we do things that are safe.
Alistair, do you agree with that?
I do, and I've taken a lot of inspiration from what John and Lee have described, because you've taken it to the next step. I mean, the state of the art in New Zealand is that for the first time, somebody is able to authenticate themselves, go online and generate a vaccine certificate or a vaccine pass. And that's been a terrific step for us, because it involves that authentication step, and it involves getting access to structured information that is does not rely on somebody eyeballing it for it to make sense. It's coded, it uses our standards, albeit in a very narrow way, just around the description of a vaccination event. But we see it spreading out from there to doing the kind of things you're doing around, giving the person the ability to control that record and say, yes, I'm going to share it with this provider, or I'm going to share it across this border. So thank you for your example.
We have a question in the Q&A for, and excuse my pronunciation here, it's Oyvind Aasve. On a national level, how do you see IPS positioned in relation to a broader set of other FHIR international implementation guides? So interesting question there. Maybe John can look at that.
I'm not sure I'm actually the best person for that. I don't know if Alistair or Lee have any particular comment.
So I'm happy to come in on this one, Johnny, if that helps. So
Yeah.
I would question why not. If we've got that many international standards already, whether that's around products, fuel in cars, you know, buildings, etc. Why wouldn't we use international standards? When we create local national standards, we actually constrain ourselves to then move to that next stage. And we are a very much an international community. So, you know, if we're going to put the effort into creating national standards, then why not international standards? You know, they will not be perfect, but again, it's that working in a very agile, incremental way of we start with something and we develop. So yeah, I think it's absolutely the right thing to do. It's the thing we should definitely do, and to be honest, it's things we should make sure will happen. Otherwise, we'll just end up rebuilding something we've created to be that will end up as a compromise. So yeah, fully support the view of an international standard rather than just very national. I do think there is an issue, like Alistair probably touched on in his presentation. There will always be national extensions to what's going on. The issue on the national extensions is just that we've got to be pragmatic. You know, fire allows that type of thing to happen already. So why not? So yeah, very, very supportive of let's go international rather than local national.
If Hirko, if I could just say a little bit on the national, international, I think you know, many in most countries probably have indigenous people, and they have particular cultural considerations they need to address. So we have that in common, even if the specifics are a wee bit different. And I think if you're coming to the table as a nation to Global Digital Health Partnership, to HL7, you've got an HL7 affiliate, or SNOMED International, then that's the first step. So we should encourage wider participation around the globe in these groups, and we should make it so that it's not an exclusive club, and we extend our reach that way.
Yeah, and it does raise the question, though, in how much influence on the national use case are you willing to give away to some sort of a global governance model for this international base set? And is there something that we've learned now, aside from the pragmatic approach that we've now seen? Is there something that we can take away from this more crisis-driven approach to what we should do structurally that we are doing different now? I mean, the fact that I think I'm not explaining this right. The fact that we now have this very pragmatic approach seems to break through a pattern that we were in saying that our more indigenous needs are bigger than we thought first, because that's driving our use case. But now we find out that we can actually make this work in this global and local way. So what can we take away from that in as we exit this crisis, hopefully sometime soon? But so what kind of governance should we change? Is the GDHP, will it have a role in that? Will the WHO perhaps should have a role in that? Or is it more SDO driven like the JIC? Or
I was thinking that the WHO would be a good body. I mean, we look to them to coordinate what happens across the globe and make sure that we treat people fairly. So I think as an independent body, we should see seeing how we in our digital community can support those overarching ambitions that they're trying to achieve, and make sure that we recognize we are all one global community. And if nothing else, the spread of the virus shows that we are a completely interconnected global community.
Yeah, Alistair, you want to comment on that as well?
Yes, I think it would be really good to have WHO endorsement for the efforts that are going on, and they've been involved with a good number of these things, and the digital documentation for COVID certificates was an example. And WHO's focus is on health and wellness for everybody around the globe. So they've got recognition built into that for Indigenous people. And in our health system, in the New Zealand health system, the focus is on equity, because we realise that a good part of the population have really good health care, really good health, but there's disadvantage for large numbers, and that's our challenge, to lift that. So we can't ignore that in any of our digital exercises.
And I also have a question about the choice to start with patient-mediated IPS exchange, because that sort of like is the easiest use case we can do, because if it's patient-mediated, you don't have any privacy regulatory limitations. But where do we see that this is going if we are able to do this really patient-mediated use case? Do we think this could be then be extended towards professional-to-professional exchange, or where do you see the roadmap going?
I guess we hadn't quite got there. We were using the prototype to try it out and then learn, and as you say, ask those difficult questions. However, it does change it has the potential for changing the information asymmetry between the professional and the patient. And so there are all sorts of socio-technology issues to consider, as well as, can we do it technically? And we're exploring some of that at the moment. But it does mean that patients can be more in control and feel more empowered. And I think if we can link that to a sense of encouraging people to take that greater responsibility for their own health, then that would be a good thing. But there's all sorts of things that we're learning out of doing this exercise.
Yeah, just to add on what John says on the professional to professional piece, we are talking Firestore, fire messaging. The issue is how we do the authentication between the professionals, how we do the OAuth2 and the certification. We have a lot of design papers and information already, and I'm sure other countries have exactly the same type of thing. It's not technically a major step to make that move. The issue is, how do we deal with the culture and the process issues of all of a sudden I've got a UK record in my EPR in the Netherlands, and what does that mean? And technically, can we do some of that transfer of data? Technically, it's all doable. We're then down to how do we enable the technologies? And I think that's, John, when we was coming from, a lot of what we're using is open source, open platform, open standards. So for instance, the patient held record held, that's open source code. That's something that could be easily shared internationally, for instance, to create a capability fast. But we've all got to have that similar level of capability to be able to do that send, receive, authenticate, validate, which if we're not careful, we can get stuck in legislation and forget this is around patient care, but we're still going to be safe and secure as well. But again, there's what a patient class is safe and secure, and there's what we have the experts class as safe and secure. They're not always the same thing. We have level of grayness based on where we have legislation. So,
thank you very much, and thank you all for this excellent discussion. I think before I give it back to the chair, Don Newsham gave, I think, an excellent closing point, in that the national and the international use of the IPS is a bit of a false dichotomy. It's really about cross-border use, and borders exist between and within countries. For example, state to state, province to province, or regional health authority to another regional health authority. They're all use cases for the IPS. I think that really makes the IPS so special compared to other developments right now. So thank you, and thank you for this discussion.
A big thank you, Helco, for leading this very interesting discussion. And again, really a big thank you as the representative of GDHP for supporting us in organizing this. Really much appreciated. It's hard to conclude and to summarize a little bit this 2 hours of intensive presentations and super information which was shared. I have made a few notes throughout, and just very quickly, I think which we must all recognize is that IPS is for all of us. As a standardized global set of health data, it will allow patients to, first of all, have access to their health data, but also be treated in the best possible way when they are not in their usual place where they are treated when they are traveling. It's really across borders. Multiple standards are really playing here together, and it's very important that we have cooperation, interoperability, and JIC is playing a very important role here to coordinate and ensure that it's global, it's not national, and I think we all support the need for having global international standards. We must be aware that the IPS as we know it today is not the final one. There will be changes, there will be maintenance needed, and I think again here the JIC will play an important role as we are bringing all the standards organizations together and are talking to each other and are working together. The JIC is also in conversations with WHO on how they can contribute and be part of that also, because I believe that also that they are playing a very important role. And then we are just at the beginning of the journey, as we have seen also in the Mentimeter. The implementation will take a while, but I think it's accelerated through the situation which we are all living in. But at the end, it's all of us who need to drive the implementation. It's the ministries, it's solution providers, it's the SDOs, it's the healthcare professionals, it's really everybody. JIC tries to help with the implementation information about that. And I would like to announce that we have just now live a new website, the International Patient Summary website, which JIC is fostering. And I think you are finding a world of information here. Also, as you can see here, in a community of practice, implementation cases, etc., standards and specifications. So I think a lot of the education information requests which we saw through the breakout sessions will be fulfilled here, and this will further grow. So this is really the place to go really for all the information in the future. With that, I would really like to conclude for today. Thank you so very much for everything, for the speakers, for the participants, for taking the time. And thank you everybody for being there, and please stay informed. We are social media, and have a lovely day, and please stay safe. Goodbye.